My own wasn't quite as sad, although close. Back before my wife and I married, we went out for a couple of years. Then with no reason, she wanted to see other people and maybe get back together later. I was destroyed and I threw myself into my work instead. A year later, the guy she treated me with cheated on her and they broke up. She reached out to me once, but I chose not to engage in any conversation with her. She went back to him, and they stayed together for a few more months until he cheated on her again. After that, they finally broke things off for good. Surprisingly, she tried to contact me once more. But just like before, I didn't want to speak with her. Her actions had hurt me deeply, and I couldn't bring myself to forget that pain. She went on to another guy and they were together for 6 months or so before he began to become pretty physical with her, leaving bruises. Unfortunately, I went to a party and ended up hammered and she and I somehow ended up back together. I'm not saying all was as it was before. Far from it. I still loved her, but I have to admit I didn't trust her totally. It makes sense when you think about it. We were together for more than a year before we got married, and then she came to live with me. The house I owned was completely mine. No debts or loans on it. My grandparents had handed it over to me as a present when I finished college. It wasn't a big place, but it was a gift from my grandparents, a house they used to rent out, and it was far from the busier parts of town, tucked away along a bumpy, dusty road about 10 miles away. It was perfect for me. We both decided to wait for at least 3 years before we start having kids. Our marriage was perfect for the first 2 years, and I could have sworn we were 5. Then it happened again. Instead of leaving me, though, she brought in someone else without my approval, which I'm sure she knew it was Valentine's Day. And I got off work after a half day, put flowers in a nice card and headed on home to find a car. I knew sitting there. I knew it because it was the same car. Her old boyfriend. She dropped me for drove. I parked a distance from my house and walked the rest of the way. The front door was locked, understandably, and I went around to the back where we had a key hidden and went in the back door through the kitchen and down the hall. I made sure the living room was empty before heading towards the noise. I heard the squeaking springs and moans even before I opened the door. I cautiously peeked inside to confirm it was indeed my wife. I know it sounds unbelievable, but I had to see it for myself. And there she was, lying on her back under the covers with Tom between her legs. The blankets moved up and down as he was. Well, he was doing something really wrong with my wife. My beautiful young wife, lean and so full of love for someone else. It never dawned on me to harm them. I want her gone from my life. To see her offer everything that was mine to someone else was painful beyond what I could imagine. I had to break up the party and walked in, and he saw me first and treat pulling the covers over her face. Tom jumped out of bed as he began to pull his clothes on. I just watched quietly. The room was silent, except for the sobs coming from under the covers. When he finished dressing, he looked at me, hoping I'd get out of the way. But I continued to block the doorway, even though he was substantially larger than me. Then I broke the silence. I asked him if he was missing something important. He seemed puzzled, glancing around before returning his gaze to me. I gave him a look like he was completely clueless and said, "Take her with you, get her up, dressed, and both of you leave right now." As soon as I said that, she began screaming. By the time everything was settled, I made him drag her out of bed and forcefully put her clothes on. She'd already worn that day, and he dragged her from the house, screaming at the top of her lungs. Tom had moved back to town to his parents, and I told him over the next few days I would be dropping her stuff off at his house. Throughout all of this, he never uttered a word outside of being a well-known man whore. He was a likable guy. Unfortunately for my wife, a little too likable. I could see him forcibly holding her in the car as they drove away. True to my word, I dumped off everything of hers I could find in Tom's yard. No one came out, and I didn't knock on the door. I just threw it out. It wasn't until a few days later I found out she wouldn't go to his place. He drove her back to her parents' place, which was about 60 miles away. She kept calling both the home phone and my cell phone so persistently that I eventually unplugged the house phone and changed my number. I didn't feel like talking to her at all. A couple of days after I dropped off her belongings at Tom's place, her parents, along with Tom, drove to my house. But I told her dad, when he came to the door, that if she got out of that car, they all needed to leave. He told her to stay where I could see her begin crying again. Then both parents came in first. They apologized for her, but I told them it wasn't their fault. Then they wanted to know what they could do to make it better to help us get around it. By their reaction to my answer, I guessed it never entered their mind. I told them there was nothing they could do and that any was damaged goods, and I had no desire to have her back in my life. She cheated on me in my bed, and we're done. I told them all this in a calm, even voice, yet a very firm voice, leaving little opportunity for argument. Then I opened up and spilled everything, starting from the time we were just starting to date, and including her previous behavior. It surprised both Sue and his mom. They attempted to explain how devastated he was, but I couldn't help but snort at that. I told them she wasn't nearly as devastated as I was. She might have been intimate, but I not only lost the woman I had envisioned having children with, raising them together, and growing old while our grandchildren played around us throughout our lives. I was crying and so were both of them, but I let them know it wasn't something to be fixed and he needed to move on and find someone else. And I mentioned Tom's name, which earned me a dirty look. Sue let me know, and he swore she would never even look at Tom again, let alone take him as her man. I explained to them that it was too late. She had already chosen Tom over me, and that was the end of it. When they left, they made me promise to keep in touch with them over the phone. They were concerned about Annie and how she was struggling with everything. Hearing that just made me shake my head in disappointment and mutter about how tough it must be for her. I think it was. The next week George and his dad called and asked if I would talk to Annie, but I refused. Apparently she hadn't eaten since I booted her, or at least very little. She wasn't a big girl, and as long as she was, there was little weight she had to lose. George and Sue both begged me something that was more painful for me to hear than them to do it. It was their baby, and they were concerned she might do something harmful to herself. I had her served the next week in the papers I had drawn up. We each took out of the marriage what we brought in, which was very little, but I offered half our saving, which was substantial for 2 dumpsters, almost $30,000 from before we were married. 2. When George called me again, he was sobbing as intensely as Annie had been when Tom forcefully took her from my house. He pleaded with me, asking if I could just pause everything for a while. He wanted us both to have some time to calm down. He mentioned how Sue and Annie were even more shattered by the situation, saying that Annie had started vomiting instantly when she was served and hadn't eaten since then. They ended up calling an ambulance and she was admitted to the hospital after we hung up. I left town yet. I just left. Quit my job, give the power of my attorney to my folks to make all my decisions and also rent out my home. Then I left. The first year was spent in Alaska working on a fishing boat. During that time, I contacted no one. The second year, I was working at another fishing boat out of California, catching tuna. The next 3 years were spent in Alaska and Prudhoe Bay working in the oil fields. In 5 years, spending no money thinking at all, I made a huge sum of money made bigger, yet by investing wisely, something my proof of an employer made available to us all. I wasn't immensely wealthy, but I had enough money set aside to retire comfortably. Even if I only withdrew a small amount annually, say $50,000, I'd still be growing my investments instead of exhausting them. Additionally, I had partial ownership in a few oil and natural gas wells, as well as a stake in half a small fleet of tuna boats. The yearly income on the wells alone was okay. We had an accident in Prudhoe that made me question my mortality, and I ended up quitting and returning back to my town. My folks were shocked when I showed up on their doorstep one evening. Our conversations had been limited. I didn't want to be reminded what I had lost, but my homecoming was fantastic. And the next morning they had called all our family and a big party was planned for the next afternoon. A Saturday, they caught me up on Annie after I left. She had to be hospitalized for quite some time. She refused to eat and finally slit her wrists, trying to off herself. After a few tests, they found out why she was pregnant. George and Sue tried to reach out to my parents, hoping to reach me and share the news that I was going to become a father. They seemed to be aiming to push for a reconciliation. However, when my dad informed them that they couldn't reach me because I had left town, he politely asked George for a grandparent DNA test. George seemed pleased about the situation, but my dad's request might have surprised him. He agreed. After the birth, when it was safe enough, they did the test and it came back that I was not the father. George and Sue were nearly catatonic over the results. I did find out I was divorced, though, and he refused to take half the money, and it was still sitting in the bank after the baby was born. He had a full head of black hair, exactly like Tom. He manned up and married Annie after finding out he was a father. They had been married almost 4 years and had 2 more kids. They lived in his own house and he was making a decent living. And he stayed at home with the kids, and the few times my folks saw her, she seemed happy enough at the party. I was quite surprised when George and Sue unexpectedly showed up. Apparently, they were invited by my parents and wanted to catch up with me. We had a good chat. They mentioned that Annie seemed content with her kids, but wasn't too pleased with Tom. It seemed he was still being unfaithful. He couldn't stay faithful and had brought some unwelcome surprises home to Annie. It sounded as if she wasn't going to leave Tom over it. After all, just like I had told her folks, she was damaged goods, and who else would take her? They were both happy to hear how well I'd done Mulgaon. Although I didn't tell them I was, by our standards, rich. Not wealthy, just very well off. They were sad and both admitted they wished they were still my in-laws. I saw Annie one day when I was sitting at a local deli having a sandwich and drink while doing business online. She had her 3 kids with her and looked shocked when I looked up and we made eye contact. I wasn't angry anymore. I had put it behind me. She walked up to me much akin to a deer that is about to run, and when I didn't bite, took the seat I offered. We had a decent conversation, but when she attempted to explain and apologize, I firmly declined. I didn't want to listen to it. She made a couple more attempts until I warned her that I'd walk away. After that, I treated her to a meal. Her children were pleasant and by the end of it, I even had the eldest, a boy, sitting on my lap. At one point, she looked at Timmy sitting on my knee and began to cry, telling me he should have been my boy, and this should have been our life together. I just smiled and told her I had always dreamed the same thing at my words. She got up, grabbed her kids and diaper bag and damn near ran out the door. It was a funny thing. A year later, I was married. Who did I marry? The tenant living in my house. My folks asked me to go over and talk with her moving out and we kind of hit it off. I ended up leaving her there. She was a college student and my folks had made the rent low enough so she could afford it and really had nowhere else to go. We started dating and after a few months we knew it was true love. I didn't bring up a prenuptial agreement. Maybe I should have, but I didn't. You see, Jenny wasn't aware she was marrying a financially stable man. I wasn't the richest person, but I wasn't struggling either. I had my financial affairs in order. She believed I was simply moving from job to job across the country without much to my name. Hell, I was living at home with my parents after we'd been married a few months and I still wasn't looking for a job. She finally came to me with a worried look, wondering if I was planning on it. Her biggest concern was that I might leave for a long-term job, leaving her alone for long periods of time. I really had fun when I sat her down and began explaining I'd put a little money away. I was planning we could live on. Of course, she was worried about what we'd do when it ran out. She had her teaching certificate but hadn't found a job nearby, although she found we're going to have us moving quite a distance. Her expression was unforgettable. I grabbed a piece of paper, jotted down a number, and flipped it over so she couldn't see. She was curious about what I was up to. When I mentioned it was the amount in my checking account and that I hoped it could support us for some time, she seemed surprised and intrigued. She tentatively asked if she could see it. I hemmed and hawed, acting like I was worried. Then I slid it over and she slowly turned it over, looking up at me in surprise. She was excited to know I had such amount in my checking account, although her house was small. At least we didn't have a house payment. And even though I didn't have a car or truck yet, her little car was paid for. We went out to celebrate the worry that she felt lifted from her shoulders. A week later, she was waiting. When I came in from where I had been working in the garden out back after she called for me, she had checked the account and asked me to contact the bank, saying someone had made a mistake and had deposited some money in our account. I chuckled, and she seemed puzzled by my reaction. I explained that the amount was an automatic deposit, something that happens on the first day of every month. This seemed to puzzle her even more. She left abruptly, mentioning she needed some time alone. When she returned, she found me back in the garden, and we sat down together. She observed the garden for a while, and eventually I leaned back and took a good look at her. I could tell shock was still in open display. That evening we went out to dinner. We had just our sit. When I saw Tom, Annie, and their kids across the room, both had seen us. I didn't know if they knew I was married. This was the first time I've been out with Jenny that I'd seen either one. Jenny looked when I mentioned them, but that was all. She chose to ignore them afterward. She had seen photos of my ex and heard the story, but this was the first time she'd seen those images with a name attached. Our town wasn't huge, and neither of us were keen on going out much. We enjoyed our alone time. Before our food arrived, Jenny got up and excused herself to the restroom. It wasn't until our meals arrived that I realized something was off. She wasn't seated with her family, which concerned me. Jenny wouldn't do anything, but I guess she wanted to meet the ex. Jenny never said anything, but looked a little smug when she returned. I glanced over and saw Annie sit down with her family, and it looked like she'd been crying in only a few minutes. They had paid their bill, and Tom gave me a dark look when they passed us to leave. Tears were still streaming down his face as she walked past without acknowledging me. Jenny admitted to seeing Annie leave for the restroom and felt compelled to follow her in for a conversation. After introducing herself, she simply expressed to Annie that she would never understand what she had lost. As for the rest of the conversation, Jenny didn't share it with me, and to be honest, I wasn't interested in hearing it anyway. Annie was my past. Jenny was my future. Over the next few years, we welcomed our 2 beautiful children, a boy and a girl, And while we lived in the same house, Jenny drove the same car and was working at the local high school. Finally, while I drove my same new Chevy pickup I bought, things were good for us and we lived peacefully. Even during the summers, we preferred to stay home and tend to our little house. We didn't feel the need for much more. As for Annie and Tom, well, let's just say the best revenge is living a good life. Tend to our little house. We didn't feel the need for much more. As for Annie and Tom, well, let's just say the best revenge is living a good life. Thank you for tuning in to watch. Feel free to share, like, and subscribe for more stories like this.